Well, welcome everybody to this webinar, Beneath the Waves, the Deep Sea Climate Change and COP28, hosted by the Deep Sea Conservation Coalition. I'm Natalie, and on behalf of the DSCC, we are really delighted to have you with us today to celebrate Deep Day 2023. The DSCC has over 100 members across a range of organisations that have the collective aim of reducing the greatest threats to the deep sea and safeguarding the long-term health, integrity and resilience of deep sea ecosystems. A bit of background to Deep Day. So Deep Day was started in 2020 when the world was largely in COVID-19 lockdowns, and it was created as a way to explore whether we could boost engagement and raise the volume of communications on the deep sea by creating a week-long space to appreciate the marvels and significance of the deep. Originally a week-long event, Deep Week ran in 2020 and 2021 online, and as the world began to transition back to in-person events, Deep Week is now Deep Day. And through celebrating Deep Day, the DSCC looks to maintain a dedicated online space for the deep ocean, building on the success of previous years. So for Deep Day 2023, as we approach the UNFCCC COP28 in just 2 weeks' time, where world leaders will be coming together to make commitments to decarbonise economies and reduce the pace of climate change, the DSCC wants to consider the role of the ocean, and in particular, the deep ocean, in these climate change discussions. During today's webinar, we will be hearing from 3 excellent speakers on the intricate connections between the deep sea and global climate, the threats to the critical services that the deep sea provides, and discussing the opportunities for integrating deep ocean biodiversity into the UNFCCC. Before we get started, a few housekeeping points. The chat has been disabled, but we will be taking questions through the Q&A function. So please do pop your questions for our speakers in there as we go along, and we will be looking to answer as many of them as possible at the end after we've heard from all 3 speakers. And we are also recording today's webinar, which will be made available on the DSCC YouTube channel next week. So to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Lisa Levin. Lisa is a distinguished Professor Emerita at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography and a marine ecologist who studies deep sea and shallow benthic ecosystems with a focus on climate change and direct human impacts. Lisa is also a co-founder and co-lead of the Deep Ocean Stewardship Initiative, DOSI, and helps lead the DOSI Climate Working Group and the Deep Ocean Observing Strategy, a Decade for Ocean Science programme, which brings climate science to policymakers and raises awareness about climate change in the deep ocean. Lisa has participated in numerous UNFCCC COPs and is an author on multiple IPCC reports. So Lisa, over to you.
Thank you. Let me just ask if everybody can see my screen okay. Looks okay?
Yeah.
Great. All right. So I am going to lead off this discussion of climate change and the deep ocean and deep ocean biodiversity, and try to give you an overview about what the deep sea does in terms of the carbon cycle and keeping our climate stable. And then I'll talk a bit about climate impacts on the deep ocean. So I'm pretty sure this is an informed audience, and you know that as scientists, we consider the deep sea to be all the waters below 200 meters. This is most of the ocean. Many people might not know that 75% of our exclusive economic zones are actually deep water, and more than 95% of the habitable ocean is deep sea. So it's a vast, vast area. We've come to understand that life in the deep sea is not one thing. There is no deep sea. It's highly heterogeneous with many different ecosystems, just like we have many on land, we have many in the deep sea. And each of these ecosystems hosts its own specialized biodiversity, and it's a hugely biodiverse realm. We now recognize that Deep ocean biodiversity provides many functions and services of value to people. There are provisioning services in the form of fish and shellfish, oil, gas, pharmaceuticals, industrial agents, and minerals. There are many supporting functions, providing habitat, food web support, refuge, and nursery grounds for species that we actually do care about, both commercial and non-commercial. It provides very important regulating services in the form of carbon sequestration and nutrient cycling, and I'll come back to this. And we recognize the biodiversity in the deep sea is a value in and of itself, not just for genetic resources and biomaterials, but for allowing the ocean to adapt to change. And then we have cultural services, scientific research, communications cable space, artistic inspiration and education as other important services provided by the deep ocean. We know that there's a large amount of carbon captured and stored on the high seas annually, about 500 million, just under 500 million tons of carbon. And it's been estimated that the value for carbon storage in the deep sea is about 159 billion. So there is a great value, and I want to talk a little bit about how this comes to be. We know the ocean is a great climate mitigator, taking up massive amounts of heat from the atmosphere and about a quarter of the excess carbon dioxide. And some of that the carbon is taken up through 3 different styles of pumps. We call them pumps when it moves from the surface to the deep sea. The physical pump through thermohaline convection moves carbon dioxide from the atmosphere into the water and into the deep ocean through what we call the conveyor belt. There's a carbonate pump where small plankton in the surface produce shells made of calcium carbonate skeletons, either calcite or aragonite, and these particles sink into the deep ocean where they are sequestered. And so that's another way of getting carbon out of the surface into the deep ocean. And then we have the biological pump. That's probably most familiar to people, where phytoplankton take up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. It's fed on by either microbes or small zooplankton, fed on by bigger zooplankton and fish, and eventually that carbon makes its way down either through sinking or vertical migrations down into the deep sea, and that's the biological pump. We are starting to recognize the importance of larger organisms like fish, whales, and macroalgae for sinking into the deep sea and bringing carbon down there. So we now know that there is a whale pump where whales migrate. There is the twilight zone carbon migrations where billions of small crustaceans and fish migrate 400 to 1,000 meters every day and carry carbon down. There's carbon transferred through the food web. There's carbon stored in the biomass of mammals and fish. There is carbonate produced by bony fish. There are whale falls bringing carbon down into the deep sea. So there are many, many different ways that marine life and biodiversity brings carbon to the seafloor. And most diagrams, both of the biological carbon pump and this one, depict the ocean floor. If it's depicted at all, it looks like a flat brown line, just like you see here. But we know that the deep ocean and its seafloor is comprised of a vast array of marine ecosystems. And I'd like to make the point that these all have really important roles in the carbon cycle. Some of them have really high rates of carbon preservation because they sit beneath productive upwelling areas like oxygen minimum zones or our canyons and fjords. Sometimes the carbon sequestered in the skeletons, like in cold water coral reefs, which may extend for many thousands of kilometers and have very deep piles of rubble that store carbon. There are areas that sequester carbon just because they're so vast, like our abyssal plains, which I think covers something like 75% of the bottom of the ocean, maybe store a huge amount of carbon. We have some habitats like seamounts, where there, and the canyons where there are really dense aggregations of animals, and the biomass is stored in the animal tissues. We have, of course, very important roles of the deep pelagic and vertical carbon transport. We have methane seeps that actually filter out and remove methane and prevent it from getting it into the atmosphere. Methane's a very, very potent greenhouse gas. So there are both microbes and animals that can oxidize that methane or even precipitate carbonate, that carbonate rock, which stores the methane on the seafloor. So, and then finally, we have hydrothermal vents, which fertilize the ocean, releasing iron, which is a really important part of maintaining the productivity of the oceans. So we tend not to think about the seafloor and all its carbon services, but there are many ecosystems with many different services. Now, we know that carbon dioxide emissions are warming the atmosphere, and that heat is taken up into the ocean and producing both acidification, warming, and deoxygenation. And the IPCC tells us in the recent SROC report in 2019 that there are many different deep sea ecosystems that are at risk. These burning ember diagrams show, color-coded at the level of risk. But I want to point out where we're already, with El Niños this year, we're at 1.5 degrees C already. And so many of the different ecosystems, upwelling, cold water corals, seamounts, abyssal plains, and vents and seeps are either at risk now or they will be very soon from climate change. So we know, you've seen this, that the ocean takes up about 93% of the heat, and this leads to warming, but the changes in stratification and of the ocean and solubility of gases leads to massive oxygen loss and to productivity decline, which that surface production is food supply for much of the deep sea. And then we know that uptake of carbon dioxide directly leads to ocean acidification. And all these changes happen at the surface, but thermohaline circulation transports that surface water to great depths, and it's leading to a deep sea floor that now has reduced food supply, reduced pH, reduced oxygen levels, and rising temperatures. So what is this doing to deep sea biodiversity? Well, we know the deep ocean is warming, especially in the southern half of the ocean. And that leads to species redistributions, for example, crab invasions from South America to Antarctica. It's leading to tuna redistributions. They're moving from west to east, changing countries, basically, and where they can be fished. And there are also oxygen losses causing shoaling of many fishes, including potentially tuna. So they become more aggregated at the surface, more subject to overfishing. Ocean warming also has the potential, and we believe it is releasing some excess methane through dissociation of frozen gas hydrates along our continental margins. I mentioned oxygen loss. On average, the ocean has lost 2% of its oxygen over the last 50 years, although some areas have lost much more. Off California, 20 to 30% of the oxygen is gone at 200 to 300 meters. This is a result of stratification, changes in solubility, and at the same time that the ocean is declining in oxygen, warm waters are leading animals to require more oxygen. And we know that this loss, called deoxygenation, affects nearly all biogeochemical and biological processes at all levels, from the individual to communities, to the ecosystems and the services they provide. We know that deoxygenation is effectively habitat loss. Big animals will leave areas of low oxygen, basically losing habitat. Those that can't will die, and we often see manifestations of these as mass mortality up on shore, and there are some shallow water examples here, but in deep waters, there is habitat compression. Animals like big billfish and tunas getting shoaled into shallower and shallower water as oxygen minimum zones expand. This leads to predation, excess predation, and overfishing. So where oxygen is already low, there are small changes in oxygen and in oxygen decline can matter. Let's see if I can get advanced here. And this leads to altered food webs, altered nutrient and carbon cycling, often lamination and the halt of bioturbation, and changes in our many different ecosystem services. And then another major consequence of climate change is ocean acidification. This leads to lower pH and declining aragonite saturation state, making it harder for calcifying animals to lay down their skeletons. We see a lot of the changes in aragonite saturation state since the pre-industrial era are most intense in the polar regions and along continental margins. And it's believed that this is affecting cold water coral systems, and dissolution is happening particularly in the non-living parts of the cold water coral reefs, which is all the rubble that is built up under the corals. And it's worth pointing out that there are special features of deep sea ecosystems that mediate vulnerability to climate disturbance and make them highly invulnerable. The great longevity and late maturation of deep sea organisms is one of these. They can live for hundreds of years if fish and thousands of years if corals or sponges. The high habitat heterogeneity means that there's a lot of endemism, so not everything responds the same way to climate change. The dependence on hydrologic and geochemical properties, the strong mutualistic interactions among animals, and the very strong connections to the surface all make these ecosystems very vulnerable to climate change. We know that climate change affects connectivity. Mostly we know this through modeling, that there can be changes in linkages among hydrothermal vents, both increases and lost connections due to changes in deep water circulation, and that there can be habitat loss for cold water corals and deep sea fish, but some areas will remain as refugia, and I would argue these should be prioritized for protection. And this is my, I think this is my last slide, and I just want to point out that the deep ocean is not very well recognized in climate policy at this point. If we look at the nationally determined contributions, how nations will meet their Paris Agreement goals, and look at all the ocean topics, we find deep ocean sits down near the bottom alongside deoxygenation. If we look at submissions to the UNFCCC Ocean Dialogue in 2020, again, there's deep ocean right at the bottom of all these ocean topics. So there's certainly room for increased awareness. So it's great that this webinar is happening. And then I guess I have another slide. I did want to point out that this intersection of climate and biodiversity is limited among policy instruments. And this paper led by Laura Eisler showed using the ocean carbon focus factor, which shows the link between climate and biodiversity, that only 3 treaties do a really good job of linking these two features: the Convention on Migratory Species, the International Convention on the Regulation of Whaling, and the London Convention and Protocol. Although we need to update the BBNJ count because this was based on an old draft. So linking these two, and you're going to hear from Susanna more about this, but DOCI's doing a great job with its policy briefs, both bringing climate change to the High Seas Treaty and bringing biodiversity into climate change policy. And with that, I'll thank you all.
That was great. Thank you so much, Lisa, for highlighting how incredible the deep ocean does and what it is doing for us every single day. So our second speaker is Dr. Sarah Seabrook. Sarah is an ocean scientist at the National Institute of Water and Atmospheric Research in New Zealand, specialising in marine biogeochemistry. In her research, she seeks to understand how marine ecosystems are responding to ongoing climate change and what this means for ecosystem functions and services. Sarah is also co-lead of the Climate Working Group for DOCI, working to integrate ocean science into policy development. And she has participated in multiple UN climate conferences and will be at the upcoming COP28. So over to you, Sarah.
Thank you very much. I will share my screen. Can everybody see that okay?
Yeah, it's great. Thank you.
Okay, awesome. Thank you very much. I will here in this talk now talk back over some of these impacts that we're seeing to deep sea climate services from climate change itself, and then also due to human activities in the deep ocean. So to summarize, as we just saw, the ocean, it is our greatest climate regulator. It's taken up about 90% of the heat and about 25% of the carbon dioxide associated with human greenhouse gas emissions. But this has come at a cost, with increasing greenhouse gas emissions pushing the ocean towards potential tipping points, including the increased heat uptake contributing to ocean warming and thereby ocean deoxygenation, and the increased carbon dioxide uptake contributing to ocean acidification. Ocean warming has been increasing every year globally across ocean depths, and you can see that here in this figure, where across the ocean depths from the shallow to the deep, you see in the red to orange colors here, the increased temperature occurring within these deeper depths. And as the ocean has been warming, it has been causing physical changes to the ocean itself. As Lisa described, it has been increasing ocean stratification. There's been about a 5% increase in ocean stratification between 1960 to 2018. And this has been basically disconnecting some layers of the ocean from each other and contributing to reduced upwelling and downwelling. And this is really important because these processes of upwelling and downwelling that occur across the ocean are really important for redistributing nutrients and also for sinking carbon from the surface to ocean depths where it can be sequestered away. So if you have reduced downwelling, then you also can have reduced carbon sequestration in these areas. Simultaneously, this has been coupled to changes in ocean circulation patterns. Lisa described the thermohaline circulation, also known as the global ocean conveyor belt, where you have ocean currents that connect across all ocean basins, moving water over a 1,000-year time scale across the entire globe. And due to the impacts of warming on the ocean itself, in some areas, we're seeing decreased transport in some of these currents, and in other areas, we're seeing increased transport. And because this thermohaline circulation is a really big contributor to how carbon and nutrients are brought through the ocean, brought down to ocean depths, and even how some larvae in the ocean can move around to connect habitats, it's been causing a lot of changes. It changes the transport of heat, of salt, of oxygen. It also contributes to changes in weather patterns. Some of you may know of the Gulf Stream due to the role that it plays for regulating weather in the northeast of North America, as well as in Europe. And similarly, and just to reiterate, the changes to this thermohaline circulation in itself also contribute to the amount of carbon that the ocean can actually take in. At the same time, these warmer, more stratified oceans hold less oxygen, and thus oxygen minimum zones have been expanding around the world. You can see that in this figure here with the colors that are closer to orange and red representing areas that are losing oxygen. Since 1960, there's been about a 2% global average loss in ocean oxygen and up to 40% loss in some regions. At the same time, the excess carbon dioxide that ocean acidification has, that the ocean has been taking in, has been contributing to ocean acidification, which is decreasing ocean pH and alkalinity. And this leads to a host of consequences in itself for ocean life and for processes that occur throughout the ocean depths, taking in carbon and transporting it to the ocean depths, as Lisa described. If we look at these processes together, the cumulative impact of warming, acidification, and deoxygenation, in addition to the physical changes, there's also biogeochemical changes that are occurring. So we're seeing changes in ocean productivity, We're seeing changes to the biological pump. This was described by Lisa just previously, where it's this complex process where many different organisms within the ocean across ocean depths contribute to carbon from the surface being exported down to the deep. And along with this, you have changes to carbon and nutrient flow across ocean depths, as many of these different pumps that Lisa was describing are impacted by these changes. And coincidingly, this causes changes in food supply to the deep ocean. And this also changes the amount of carbon and the amount of food that makes it to the ocean sediments at the bottom of the seafloor. So these changes in themselves, warming, decreased carbon flux to the deep sea, ocean deoxygenation and acidification, change carbon and nutrient burial in deep sea sediments. It changes how the community functions in these deep sea sediments, and it changes how much nutrients are re-released to the overlying water and how much carbon is taken back into the sediment. In addition to these biogeochemical changes, we also see biologic changes, as Lisa was describing. We see shifting ocean biomass and biodiversity, and this figure here is showing in colors that are closer to orange and red again. You're seeing changes in biomass. So these are places that are losing or decreasing in biomass under two climate scenarios. On the left-hand side, you have the low emission scenario, and on the right-hand side, you have the high emission scenario. And you can see how in this higher emission scenario, there is a higher loss of biomass across the oceans. At the same point in time, it's shifting the habitable zone for deep sea animals. And this study here is quite interesting, where they looked at the speed at which different animals will have to move in order to retain the habitable zone that they live in. And just to summarize, these colors that are blue and red across these maps are indicating areas where the animals within them will have to move quite fast in order to be able to maintain their habitable zones. And this plays in to the impacts that were described on deoxygenation, restricting habitable zones for animals, on acidification, restricting habitable zones, and on warming, restricting habitable zones. So we can look at all of these changes together, from the excess heat and the excess carbon dioxide that the ocean has been taking in, the physical changes, the biogeochemical changes, and the biologic changes, and the role that they play in impacting how much carbon the ocean can continue taking in, but also how much recycling can happen in the ocean itself, how much biodiversity and life can be supported through the ocean processes that have been occurring for millennia. But these impacts aren't happening by themselves. They're multifaceted cumulative impacts that are co-occurring with direct human activity in the deep ocean. And this together is pushing the ocean towards these potentially catastrophic tipping points. This includes impacts associated with certain fishing activities, with oil and gas extraction, with proposed mining. And when we consider these impacts from these proposed or ongoing extractive activities, we can see that the industrialization of the deep ocean may limit carbon sequestration or the amount of carbon that is released from the seabed, and could further impact ocean life. If we think about oil and gas activities, oil spills associated with this can contribute to seafloor smothering. And you can see that in this image here. And this is an image that we have seen a lot of since the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, where there is a significant amount of oil that smothered deep sea ecosystems. But similarly, this happens during just routine leak from wells and other activities where you have oil that can impact the biological pump, the amount of carbon and nutrient transfer to the deep sea, and the amount of carbon that is buried in deep sea sediments. Benthic trawling can impact particle resuspension and have biogeochemical impacts. And so here in the lower right-hand side, we can see a water column acoustic plot, which is looking at during a trawling activity on the seafloor, how much sediment is resuspended. And the yellow and orange colors are showing you that sediment that is resuspended there in that figure. But it's not just sediment that's resuspended in these processes. In the study, they also were able to see carbon, metals, methane, and nutrients that are resuspended with those sediments. On the left-hand side of this slide, we can see, as an example, the methane concentration 2 hours after trawling and 20 hours after trawling. And this is looked at from the seafloor up into the water column across the distance from the trawl track. And you can see that this sediment resuspension, the dissolved compounds that are released during this activity, can cause this longer-term impact over these hours after trawling, increasing methane concentration above the seafloor. Seabed mining can similarly cause sediment resuspension and midwater ocean plumes. We can see these dewatering plumes in this figure here, and you can see the plumes near to the seafloor as well. And these impacts, they can have impacts on individual species, including impacting their feeding, impacting their respiratory system. It can change populations, including impacting the community composition, and it could change ecosystem services. And I'll highlight importantly that one of those ecosystem services that it can impact is carbon transport itself, as well as biodiversity. Proposed mesopelagic fisheries can have an impact as well on deep ocean ecosystem services. In this slide by Svenja Halfter, you can see the really complex processes that can be impacted by proposed mesopelagic fisheries, including reducing fish and invertebrate biomass, damaging habitats, and impacting daily and seasonal migration of fish and invertebrates that inject carbon into the deep sea as part of that biological pump. So under provisioning services, we could see that target species and bycatch that are removed could negatively impact the food web and biodiversity in the deep sea. Under regulating services, we could see that a change in animal diversity and biomass could lead to a decline in carbon storage and efficiency. With supporting services, we could see that by altering the food web and damaging important habitats such as seamounts, mesopelagic fisheries could disrupt the recycling of nutrients. And in cultural services, we could see that declining food abundance could negatively impact tourism and recreational fisheries. At the same time, ocean-based climate intervention technologies that are intended to increase the amount of carbon that the ocean can take in could also have unintended consequences for biodiversity and carbon sequestration services. It could reduce carbon fixation, contribute to deoxygenation and acidification, alter carbon transfer, and contribute to seafloor smothering, greenhouse gas release, and reduce carbon burial. And while techniques will be required to increase the amount of carbon that the Earth can take in, we need to have a proper research to ensure that the technologies we do employ do not cause further harm to carbon fixation processes across the ocean. We can see that the seafloor is changing. The amount of carbon that's making it to the seafloor is changing through decreased carbon flux. Oxygen is decreasing across the world ocean. The pH is decreasing, contributing to ocean acidification, and temperature is increasing. These changes will be decreasing ecosystem resilience to disturbance. Reduced food supply can slow recovery from disturbance. Ocean acidification can dissolve non-living cold water coral habitat and reduce coral recovery from disturbance. Oxygen decline can cause loss of biodiversity in foundation species, exacerbating biogeochemical stress. And rising temperatures can increase metabolic demand and redistribute species in biogenic habitat. So when we think of these cumulative impacts in relation to deep ocean priorities at COP28, I'll highlight that the biggest thing that we really want to see come out of COP28 is strong moves towards reducing emissions. In these plots here, the blue lines show the lower emission scenarios, and you can see that in every instance, the lower emission scenarios result in less warming, in a higher ocean pH and less ocean acidification, and in more oxygen remaining in the ocean. Similarly, we need to make sure that as policies are developed, we maintain a precautionary approach that's informed by research when exploring ocean climate mitigation technologies or new extractive technologies. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sarah. It's certainly really sobering to hear how human activities are impacting the deep ocean and how, you know, the services that so many of us take for granted are under threat. But how can the international community address some of those threats to the deep? And our third speaker is Dr. Susanna Lidström. Susanna is a researcher in environmental history at the KTH Royal Institute of Technology in Sweden. This year, she is also a visiting scholar at Scripps Institution of Oceanography. Her areas of research include the history of ocean science, as well as marine science and policy. And Sarah is also leading a DOSI policy brief on the deep sea and high seas. Susanna.
Thank you, Natalie, and thank you for inviting me. I will also try to share my screen. Can everyone see that okay?
That's great, thank you.
Great. Thank you. So I will talk about a few ways that the deep sea can be addressed at COP28. I cannot forward. I think I will have to start over. Hang on.
Susanna, you can forward at the bottom after you
Okay.
go in.
Yeah, now it works. I just had to. Okay. Thank you, though. So this, my presentation is based, as has been mentioned, on a new policy brief prepared by DOSI and the DOSI working groups on climate change, biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction, and the biodiversity task force. So these ideas that I will present, they're not just my ideas, but the result of a communal effort by DOSI to try to brainstorm and think about ways that deep ocean biodiversity can be addressed at COP28. So just a little bit of background, as Lisa mentioned, ocean and climate governance have really been separate in the past. So just to mention, I mean, there are many treaties and agreements that are relevant to both the ocean and climate change, but I'll just mention the most central ones here, which include the UNFCCC and the UN Law of the Sea. So the UNFCCC, as you know, is an intergovernmental agreement, which means that it addresses areas within national jurisdiction. So as Lisa also mentioned, the ocean has historically been very underrepresented within the UNFCCC, and this is especially true for the deep and the international ocean. So the deep ocean is instead mostly governed through the UN Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS, which is an international agreement for all marine activities, including and mostly focused on international areas. And so UNCLOS also includes the new agreement for conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction, which many of you will know about. It was agreed this year. It has been signed by many states and will hopefully be implemented in the next couple of years. So the ocean climate policy nexus is really only starting to emerge, I would say. So having this separate history, several initiatives are now starting to change this picture. An important part of that is the special report on the ocean and cryosphere produced by the IPCC in 2019. The year after that, the UNFCCC established the Ocean and Climate Change Dialogue, which provides a space for discussing how to connect these two areas of governance. And last year was also the first year that the UNFCCC COP included an ocean pavilion, and there will be one this year as well. So it's becoming more interconnected, but also still within these different initiatives, for the ocean, the deep ocean, remains very underrepresented. So from that, I will move on to some opportunities to continue to change this picture and talk about opportunities to incorporate deep ocean biodiversity into UNFCCC policy. As Lisa mentioned, 75% of exclusive economic zones are deep ocean. And in other words, 135 out of 194 signatories to the Paris Agreement have deep ocean in their national waters. So deep ocean biodiversity can definitely be addressed through national policies, but most of the deep ocean is still international waters. So we have come up with 3 categories for addressing deep ocean biodiversity through the UNFCCC. And these include existing mechanisms under the UNFCCC, harmonization of the UNFCCC policies with other relevant treaties, and extension of the UNFCCC to also address international waters. So I'll go through some specific examples of these. So the first one refers to nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, and national adaptation plans. So NDCs are perhaps the most important mechanism under the Paris Agreement, where each country explains how they will contribute to reaching the goals of the agreement. These are submitted and then updated every 5 years. And national adaptation plans are documents that identify vulnerabilities to climate change and then related adaptation plans to address those vulnerabilities. And those are voluntary, not all countries have those. So opportunities to protect deep ocean biodiversity in the NDCs and NAPs include, for example, establishing marine protected areas and also making sure that those marine protected areas are managed with considerations of climate change impacts. It includes allowing recovery of marine biodiversity in other ways, including both ecosystems and species-based conservation, such as whales, for example, which are important for the carbon cycle. Climate change can be incorporated into fisheries management, which are also important in the NDCs. Activities that may disturb carbon at the seafloor can be very carefully regulated or perhaps even prohibited, such as bottom trawling or deep sea mining. And countries can also make sure to avoid any ocean-based climate interventions that may disturb existing carbon cycle functions of the deep sea. So another mechanism under the Paris Agreement is the global stocktake, which is an exercise every 5 years where it's a new mechanism. I think that this is the first year that it is being done. The point is to evaluate all the NDCs in relation to the goals and see where we're at. And so here we suggest that the deep ocean should be a category, and specifically deep ocean biodiversity should be a recognized category under the global stocktake relevant to climate change mitigation and adaptation. And we also suggest that the stocktake should not just look at national contributions, but also look at the role and importance and what is being done in international waters. So the next mechanism under the UNFCCC that we have considered is the loss and damage mechanism, which is a framework for identifying losses and damages that countries experience as a result of climate change impacts. They include risk management to create more dialogue on this topic between different stakeholders, and also possibilities to have support in terms of finance, technology, and capacity building. So here also we are suggesting that loss of deep ocean biodiversity should be recognized and considered within this mechanism. So the Ocean and Climate Change Dialogue, which was also mentioned before, was established in 2019. There have been 3 so far in 2020, 2022, and 2023. These are separate events. They are under the UNFCCC, but not at the COPs. They happen separately during the year. And so these are really intended to address and counter the separation between ocean and climate governance. And so here we suggest that so I should also say that in the past, most of these, or maybe all of the topics within this dialogue has been coastal and shallow and nationally focused. So here we suggest that deep ocean biodiversity could be a topic for the 2024 Ocean and Climate Change Dialogue. And we would also suggest that the deep ocean biodiversity that is addressed there should be the dialogue should consider both within and beyond national jurisdiction. So how the UNFCCC can extend. So moving beyond the mechanisms under the UNFCCC, another really important part is to align with other relevant agreements. And while there are several, we have chosen to focus on the BBNJ agreement, as I mentioned, was agreed this year. And is really important for deep ocean biodiversity. So the BBNJ agreement, as it looks now, it's not finished, but as it looks, it will provide some tools to create co-benefits between biodiversity and climate. So those can really be focused on, and I think they provide a really unique opportunity for creating those co-benefits. So one way of doing that we suggest is to establish a pathway for exchange of expertise between the scientific and technical bodies of the UNFCCC on the one hand, and whatever the equivalent will be, and also initial versions of what that will be as early as possible for the BBNJ agreement, so that there can be established communication between these 2 frameworks. So finally, I wanted to mention mention ocean climate investment. And here we suggest just highlighting the importance of considering deep ocean biodiversity protection in ocean and climate investment. And so we suggest here some examples is to make sure to not invest in and instead eliminate offshore oil and gas extraction and other forms of resource exploitation, and instead invest in recovery and protection of marine species, and also to decarbonize ship transport is also important in this area. And with that, thank you to everyone who contributed to this policy brief, and especially thank you to Lisa and Brandon who made it happen. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Susanna. That was brilliant. Really interesting to hear the opportunities for the UNFCCC and the BBNJ treaty, which we hope states will ratify as soon as possible to protect deep sea biodiversity. So on to, we've got a couple of questions in the chat and we've got 10 minutes left. So there are 2 that are very similar. So I think maybe to Lisa. So do marine organisms such as fish absorb carbon or emit carbon? And what is the most effective form of ocean carbon storage? So fish or whales. Oh, Lisa, you're on mute. Sorry.
Okay, you can hear me now. Right?
Yeah.
So, most of the carbon in the ocean is inorganic, meaning it's not in living organisms. It's in the form of dissolved, it's either inorganic carbon or it's dissolved organic carbon. So the fish and whales are not a large part of the stock, but they are important in the flux. I mean, their bodies hold carbon. Fish also can produce little carbonate pellets that they release as part of their metabolism. So that leads to more carbon storage. And of course, fishing, it's been argued, removes that carbon when we take it off and bring it to land and consume the fish, and then humans respire. So we're taking some of that carbon out of the system that would otherwise be buried. Whales are huge, and so they hold a lot of carbon, but I don't actually know the numbers about how much carbon is in whales versus how much carbon is in fish.
Brilliant. Thank you, Lisa. Just to say, if anybody else wants to ask any questions, please do pop them in the Q&A box. We have got another one here that possibly Lisa, or, well, anyone actually. Lisa said that only 3 international agreements focus on the intersection of climate and biodiversity. What are the criteria? Given that the BBNJ has not yet been ratified and implemented, and that there are might be some good surprises with the first COP, isn't it too soon to say it's not focusing on climate and biodiversity?
Do you want me to take this then? Yeah.
Yeah, if anyone
I guess it addresses something I specifically said. So I was showing the results of an analysis led by Laura Ellsler that was a word search of all of the instruments and their documents, looking at which ones incorporated both words associated with climate and words associated with biodiversity. It's not that none of them do, it's that there were only 3 that had a good connection between those 2 things. Now, the BBNJ analysis this paper was published already a year and a half ago or more. So the BBNJ treaty text wasn't completed at that time. I know there are a few more words about climate in the BBNJ text now, but not a lot. And so I imagine that bar on that graph will rise a little bit, but it's still, the biodiversity treaty doesn't incorporate all climate in all the ways it could. However, because as pointed out by Lisa Ruston, I guess, who asked the question, they're still developing the COP and the science body and the modalities and how everything will operate. So I think one of the things that we as scientists can encourage the BBNJ development of that treaty and its implementation to incorporate climate in development of MPA, design of MPAs, in all the environmental impact assessment activities, in capacity development, in all the arenas that BBNJ is involved in.
Brilliant. Thank you, Lisa. There has also been a request for copies of the slides. So the webinar has been recorded, so that will be available on the DSCC YouTube next week. And if there are, we might have a couple more questions. What is the main ask to governments at COP? Does anyone want to take that one? No.
Suzanne, I think Susanna or Sarah can take it since I've done all the talking.
Well, I think as Sarah pointed out, reducing emissions is the central task of COP. So I think that would have to be the most central one. But in addition to that, I think it's hard to say just one thing for each country. I think it's different. Considering deep ocean biodiversity, what each country can do, I think it depends on the country. What they can do in their national waters is very different, depending, of course, on what they have. And then it's also different, of course, countries who don't have deep ocean in their national waters, they can, focus on these other ways of aligning and extending the UNFCCC, because, of course, as we have understood from both Lisa's and Sarah's presentations, the deep ocean biodiversity is really important to all countries, not just those who have it in their national jurisdiction.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Susanna. Slightly more, possibly a shallow, Lisa, sorry, did you want to add?
Well, I was gonna see it. if Sarah wanted to add anything, but I'd just like to point out that reducing emissions and addressing climate change will protect deep ocean biodiversity. And that's a really important point. Now, there's a time lag, and we are committed, even if we stopped emissions today, the deep ocean will continue to lose oxygen and warm. But the sooner we tackle this problem, the more deep ocean biodiversity will remain for future generations. Yeah.
Sarah, did you want to add anything? No.
I think that covered it all really well. The only thing I'll add is, as Susanna pointed out, this COP is the global stock take, where countries will be looking at the progress they've made towards limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. And as we've seen in a lot of instances, we've been getting much closer to that 1.5 degree mark than we'd like to. And so that reducing emission component is going to be a really important task for countries to consider at this COP28.
Absolutely. So just one more question, possibly a slightly more shallow focused. Is there any obvious biodiversity damage in the Caribbean due to the unprecedented sea temperatures of last summer?
I don't think I know. I'm not sure if anybody else is aware of studies that are going on. I mean, heat waves, you know, if they're referring to a heat wave, you know, we know that it can be damaging to cold water corals, for example. So that would be one type of ecosystem that would suffer. But I'm not familiar with what studies have actually been done in the region.
Okay, I think we have answered all questions, so we will wrap up for this evening, this morning, depending on this afternoon where you are. So a huge thank you again to all of our speakers for a really inspiring hour of talks and for the great questions. Oh, there might be just one more. Oh, coral communities were impacted, yes. Yeah, so if you are interested in reading more about the deep ocean's role in climate mitigation, please do take a look at a recent synthesis report, Undisturbed, the Deep Ocean's Vital Role in Safeguarding Us from Crisis, which has been popped in the chat. And the DSCC and DOSI as well will be participating in a few events throughout COP, so do keep an eye on our social channels for more information. And I'll just finish by saying thank you so much to everybody for joining us this evening, and happy Deep Day. Thank you.